I hadn't stepped into the old trailer in more than a decade. If we weren't clearing off the lot for a new building, it might have been another 10 years. Rummaging through an old box in the trailer, the memories came flooding back. After close inspection, the beat-up old 1911 Colt had a missing hammer and used to belong to a friend who was more like family. I've listened to your stories, and I hope you find this interesting. I even took the time to write some notes because this just isn't your plain old story. Let me explain. Grandpa was always a straight shooter and a God-fearing man. Almost a century ago, when he was a young man, he'd heard legends of the wildman but gave it no thought until he himself ran into one in his neck of the woods. Something almost human-looking, upright and hairy, not to mention that it appeared to be a lot bigger than him. Rumors spread as it went by many different names. Some called it the wild man or man-beast. Some seemed to play on the fears of children and called it the boogeyman, which was just another label for the devil himself. The Chickasaw had their name for it and called it Lofa. The physical descriptions were very similar. Grandpa told me and my dad a story. It happened long ago, when he was in his 20s rabbit hunting. He stated plain and simple that his kill was stolen by a giant man that kind of resembled an ape in appearance because it was covered in hair. It deliberately made its way into the clearing ahead of me. It honed in on my rabbit as we were only a dozen yards apart. The first thing I noticed was its coat of cinnamon-colored hair. It was long, hanging down around the face and arms and legs. The hair around the body was not as long, but it was wide and very solid-looking. You could have put two of me side by side, and it still might not have been wide enough. I had a terrible feeling that if things went awry, I may have brought a veritable knife to a gunfight. I was certain that my shotgun would just agitate it. I clung to my gun, even though I wasn't going to use it. This thing kept its eye on me as it raked its hands across the grass and snatched up my rabbit. Its hands were so big that all I could see were the rabbit's feet. And that's when he kind of turned himself toward me and gave me this look, like, "Get out of here, or I'll show you my bad side." Grandpa did have a knack for storytelling, and we always just left it right there. A tall tale for sure, but that brief little story would make its way back to us in the years to come and after his death. We're going back to the 1970s, a decade of chaos across the country, but our little town wasn't all that different. I go by a nickname that my son's friends gave me. They affectionately called me Dad. My son's friends used to hang out at our house. We put together a baseball area, a basketball court, and a small little above-ground pool. My son played sports year-round. Needless to say, our oldest boy kept us pretty busy all by himself. And with that being said, my wife and I rarely had any downtime. We were young parents, and were also dealing with my father's premature death. But he was watching over us because he left us a plan, and I thank him every day for his wisdom as we grew the business from the foundations of his parcels of land. His father before him had done the same, and he in turn bought even more. We were fortunate, to say the least. It's tough when a father outlives his son. We all grieve the loss, but especially his dad, my grandpa. Grandpa was in his early 70s, and not exactly what you'd call a socialite. His second wife had passed a handful of years back. He felt alone. One day, out of the blue, this old fella named Jerry showed up on our doorstep. He said he'd been corresponding with Grandpa and were old military buddies. Jerry would work for the business as a carpenter. He also had a voluntary title, supervising the crew, checking their work and at times teaching them. By all rights, Jerry should have been retired like Grandpa and enjoying what time they had left. And I can say this, as he's probably long gone, Jerry liked to drink. A lot. But here's the thing. I never once saw him drunk or out of control. The man could put away some alcohol. He hated beer, but definitely enjoyed our fine state that happened to make his favorite whiskey. He was never late for work, even though we would look a bit pale and kind of dehydrated. These were tough times for him too, and we made arrangements for him to stay on our land rent-free. Jerry was pretty choked up and very grateful. He was my grandpa's best friend. They looked out for each other throughout the war, even saved each other's lives a time or two, and so he was treated like family. We had purchased a mostly used at the time, semi-furnished trailer and had it placed at the back of our property. It was fairly private, and once we cleaned up the lot, you could practically go hunting and fishing at the nearby stream or woods in no time at all. "I'm turning over a new leaf," said Jerry. "No more drinking, smoking, or women. The women part is easy. There's no women left my age," Jerry joked. Jerry had settled in pretty well, at least for the next few days. Payday was every Friday, and Jerry was usually the first in line at 8 a.m. But this morning, he was a no-show. How peculiar. After I cut all of the others' checks, I drove down to the trailer to see if everything was all right. Jerry cracked open the door, gun in hand. "It's me, Jerry. Everything okay? You got a woman in there or what?" I joked. He had a pretty big frown on his face. "Well, that depends. If I find out who was throwing rocks at the side of my trailer at all hours of the night, I'm likely to kill him." "What? Throwing rocks? What do you mean? No one's allowed on my land without an invite from me." Jerry really did look worse than usual. I mentioned taking the day off to get rested up. "I'm going to check around the trailer, okay?" As I walked around the trailer, it was just as Jerry had said. There were some small dents around one of the back windows. I couldn't find any rocks nearby. That was odd in itself. But even stranger, there were smudges in the dents. I could only think that maybe we had some wild kids out on our property. That would be a first, because at the time, and still to a point today, we're in a pretty rural spot. Later that day, just after lunch, Grandpa fell ill and had to be rushed to the hospital. My wife was the one that drove him, and after a few hours, called and said that I needed to consult with the doctors. I brought the kids, and we were going to grab some dinner out and then switch off. Since everyone else had gone home, I had to get Jerry to lock up the buildings. "I don't know when we'll be back. Can I count on you to keep an eye on things?" "You bet. I'll say a prayer for Albert, too." "Could you leave the keys to the truck so I can run to town and keep me posted, right?" "I'd be much obliged." That run into town could only mean one thing. It had only taken Jerry less than 24 hours to renege on his joking promise of sobriety. But in his defense, a lifetime of drinking couldn't be resolved in a day's time, and things were chaotic enough at the moment. After that run to town, and upon his return, Jerry had stocked up for the weekend. He had several bottles of his favorite Kentucky bourbon whiskey, enough for a party, or in this case, for one. Jerry had all but forgotten the incident from the night before. He was focused on dinner and drinks. It was turning a little cool on this October night. The field crickets were singing. Since there was a decent clearing in front of the trailer, Jerry had a thought to build a crude fire pit. Good thing he had access to the truck, as he borrowed a small load of my wood from the main house. A few well-placed rocks to form a crude circle ought to do it. Darkness was approaching, and Jerry still hadn't eaten yet. Anyone that camps out in the sticks, away from the artificial lights, knows that you can barely see your hand in front of your face until your eyes adjust. He always said he had bouts with night blindness. Scraping together some plastic containers, he had been marinating venison strips in a light amount of whiskey in his little trailer's refrigerator. The instant mashed potatoes were his personal favorite. Fire fully ablaze, cast iron skillet ready to go, Jerry knew this would be a feast fit for a king. The strips sizzled and smoked, carrying through the air like a waft of perfume. But now someone or something noticed and began to sniff the air. It was unmistakable and loud. Jerry was sure that he was alone. Everyone, including the crew, had left hours ago. The compound was closed, the gates were locked. He'd chained the fence himself after his trip back from town. As Jerry told me in his shaky voice, "I was on the other side of the trailer, and I could still hear sniffing. I reached for my buck knife and I shouted, 'You're trespassing on private property and the office is closed. If you don't want to get shot, I'd go out the way you came in, now!' And in an almost perfect response, something huffed and stomped, making a heavy thud, almost like a child having a tantrum. The thumps in hindsight, he said he could feel it. Heavy equipment or a large tree could do that. Neither were present. It was unexplainable. Continuing to stay hidden behind the trailer, he heard several bangs on the metal wall of the trailer. His tiny front door light began to sway. The trailer creaked. Jerry said his mouth just hit the floor. His hunting rifle was in the trailer, but his pistol was inside the truck. Now feeling a little braver after retrieving his pistol and flashlight, he yelled back once again, "If I raise my gun, my intent is to defend myself. Leave now or things will take a turn for the worse. This is your last warning." A rather large shadow now moved toward Jerry as he stood by the fire. A foul and sour-smelling odor began to overwhelm his nostrils, making his eyes water, which made him take off his glasses. Distracted and confused, he turned his flashlight toward the ground, noticing his pan had been overturned and the venison was gone. Jerry searched around the fire for any trace of the meat, but there was nothing. Something dark was outlined alongside his light beige trailer. Pointing his light, he could now see more than just a shadow. It was tall, scraggly, and hairy all over. It had a crooked-looking, bent-over posture, and it seemed to make quick jerks and movements. I shined the beam in its face, and it never stopped licking the bowl of my mashed potatoes. It dawned on me that there weren't any young vandals running around. Its right arm that held the bowl had an odd look to it. It didn't appear to have a hand. Jerry admitted he was scared, but relaxed his grip on the Colt. "Good God, I don't care who you are, but..." Before he could get another word out, the now empty bowl of what was mashed potatoes rolled towards him and into the light of the fire. It seemed to approve of his mashed potatoes by the sound of its lips smacking. Alcohol can create different moods, as I'm sure many of us know. But the one thing it did for Jerry was relax him. Jerry had no personal feelings for this thing that had eaten his food and damaged his trailer. He knew for certain what it was and remembered his best friend's story while out rabbit hunting. He was blunt and made no bones about what he did next. "I pulled the trigger, but the gun jammed. The goddamn slide. Anyway, I can vividly remember that it heard the click because that crooked-looking thing just stood straight up and puffed out its chest and growled at me. It didn't look quite so pathetic anymore. I was now face to face with something about 2 feet taller and wide as a church door. Jerry claimed he blacked out at that point because he couldn't recall anything else. I just shut down. I knew I was going to die right there. Early that morning, after returning from the hospital, my family found Jerry unconscious and sprawled out on the front porch of our house. Jerry felt embarrassed, especially in front of my wife and kids. He later confided in me what transpired after we left that day with Grandpa. And the gun, the Colt, must have gone into that box, never to be used again. Grandpa mostly recovered from his mild stroke. It left him with slurred speech and the need for a walker. The following year, he passed away in his sleep. He was our patriarch. On the subject of Bigfoot, I feel that Jerry told Grandpa everything he told me. Jerry seemed different. He never spoke to me about the encounter again. I'm pretty sure he didn't tell anyone on the crew either. There were times when I'd find him sleeping on a cot in the main workshop. He never told me why, and I didn't ask. The land between the lakes is a good distance away from my property, but I'm well aware from reading and listening to other people's encounters that something is frightening campers, hikers, and residents around there and all over. That same morning, I saw the fire pit that Jerry had constructed scattered about, saw the even more dense up on the trailer, and what looked like large naked footprints all over the grounds around his trailer home. A few weeks later, on a random day of the week, Jerry left. I found a note on his trailer door. He felt like it was time for him to go and was planning on heading south to a little town on the Gulf in Florida. I assume he had a contact or something down there. I was happy if he was happy. Some people just have to wander. It's what they do. I wouldn't be surprised if this incident was a motivator. Should I consider myself lucky for never seeing one of these creatures? I'll admit I've heard some strange howls mixed with the coyotes. But no, I've never seen one, and I'm okay with that. It didn't immediately occur to me until I wrote this all down that Jerry's trailer sat pretty much where our old landfill used to be. That is, until we cleared it out. CJ.